This lecture focuses on the last chapter we covered, imperialism. You guys are going to have a test tomorrow, so I definitely would go through this a little bit and maybe take a few notes or write down things that maybe you feel like you're not really recalling. All right. So there will be a couple questions that focus on the economic motives, why European countries decided to colonize the Caribbean, India, China. Mostly, a lot of it had to do with the Industrial Revolution. So, as European nations, especially England, were industrializing, right? Developing factories, starting to manufacture more goods, they needed more raw materials. And a place like India had plenty of cotton. Um, Places like Africa had rubber. So they definitely needed these colonies for their own machinery, right? So again, some of the raw goods were cotton and rubber. They needed workers to help build railroads. Most of the labor that was done was the workers were paid very low wages, and the jobs were very dangerous. So again, these factories needed workers, and also a market. Africa, India, China. It was a great place to sell European finished goods, especially textiles, right? So the cotton would come into England, and it would be obviously turned into clothing. So again, the three motives were raw materials, labor, just needing workers, and also again a market, a place to sell goods. So the colonies were known as export economies. They didn't necessarily, import anything. They didn't manufacture their own goods. They basically existed to provide these raw goods for the mother country. Cash crops, for example. So a lot of the Caribbean colonies, like Barbados, they existed to grow sugar for the mother country. As a result, a monoculture developed, and what this means is that these colonies, like a place like India, basically they lacked a lot of diversity economically, especially from an agricultural standpoint, meaning they only produce one crop. And that's a problem, especially if there's crop disease. If that crop fails, that will leave that country really in dire straits. And long-term, African nations really struggled with that. When European colonies left Africa, these African nations really had nothing to produce or one crop to produce. You think of a country like the United States, we have a multitude of agricultural products that we export. So, again, these colonies became, really, they lacked diversity from an economic standpoint. The parent country, or England, would actually limit manufacturing. They didn't want competition for their own homebound factories. So, for example, in India, the Indians were not allowed to manufacture their own textiles, and they had to depend on British textiles. And again, that's going to erode, India's ability to be independent economically, and self-sufficient. And going forward, that would be a problem in the modern era when these colonies were, on their own. Railways were very important in the colonies. They were built by the mother country in Africa and India, mostly to help govern that colony, especially a large country like India, or connect British colonies in Africa. Also to help fight wars on the African continent. These railways were usually employed native workers, but the wages were very low, as I mentioned earlier. One of the famous railroad creators was Cecil Rhodes. He actually was the founder of De Beers Diamonds. I believe that still exists today. And he attempted to build a railroad from South Africa to Egypt to make it easier for England to govern. That didn't make it. They didn't complete the whole railroad, but railroads were built in Africa. And again, the purpose mostly, not only to govern, but to extract resources. You could, mine diamonds in South Africa and get them to the Mediterranean, right, by rail. That was the goal. Labor. So, what are some of the labor groups that emerge? So, because of imperialism, you're going to see a lot of labor migration. So, for example, Indian laborers would move from India to other British colonies in the Caribbean or even in Fiji. Chinese, Japanese workers, they too migrated to places like Hawaii and Cuba. So basically, you're going to see, migrants or workers from these colonies have the opportunity to leave their colony and find work outside of that colony. I don't know if that was such a good thing. The wages and the work was usually very difficult. Penal colonies. So Australia is interesting. Actually, Australia was founded as a penitentiary colony. So convicts from England, Ireland were actually sent to not only Australia but also to India. They could work for their freedom. Unfortunately, it was destructive to Aborigine societies in Australia because of the disease that was spread. So definitely remember that. That's probably going to be on the test. So again, another example of migration. In this case, it was really forced migration. These prisoners were forced to go to Australia, but again, it obviously created opportunities for them in the long run. So overall, what was the effect? A lot of cultural transfers or synthesis. So these workers from India, for example, would bring their customs, their religion, their food, food preparation, and language to other places, like Fiji, for example. And if you go to Trinidad, if you go to Fiji, you'll see remnants of Indian culture there. All right, so what were the political motives for imperialism? Pretty simply, to own or control colonies was a sign of power. And, a mother country like England or France felt that they needed to assert their identity or strengthen their political influence in the world. And having colonies would do that. It was also a source of national pride. Really, it was competitive to outdo other nations. How many colonies can you have, right? Accumulate not only wealth but also land. There was a military part of it too, where if you had these colonies, you could put Navy ships there. You could be closer to other important resources, and your military could be closer to those locations. It was known as the scramble for Africa. You might see that term, where all these countries were basically scrambling to seize parts of Africa. Again, probably more for economic reasons, but there was kind of a nationalistic, reasoning for that too. Add to your stable in a way. It would be kind of like someone collecting cars, right? How many cars do you really need? But it was a source of wealth, and it was a source of kind of national pride. Japan also started to expand during this time. They entered into Taiwan and Korea. If you go to Korea, you'll see a lot of Japanese influence today. All right, what were the ideological motives? So social Darwinism played a big part of that. And if you recall, Charles Darwin was a scientist, or maybe not a scientist, but he believed in this idea that certain species survived and other species did not. The survival of the fittest, right? The fittest species would make it, and that's just the way it was. That was to be accepted, and that scientific theory was applied to society. And this idea that there were some groups of people, especially native peoples in India, Asia, Africa, who were just unfit. Therefore, England was justified in their colonization and then their conversion of these people to Christianity, for example, or exposing them to Western culture, education. So it was really used to justify colonization. It was backward, but it was again something that was used also here in the United States. The idea of these people are unfit. We will do our best to raise them up, but if they fail, then you know what? That's just the way it is, and no problem. There was missionary work. So again, these Europeans didn't want these people to fail or struggle, but they just never really believed they were, on the same level culturally. But there was an attempt to at least Christianize them and assimilate them. So medical aid and education was established in these places. But overall, I think the impact was pretty negative, and a lot of traditional cultures were wiped out over time. All right, let's talk about colonization in South Asia or India. The Portuguese were really the first Europeans to establish contact in this region through trading posts, but then the British followed. The British East India Company, kind of a famous or an early corporation or joint stock company, they actually expanded into this region mostly for the cotton, definitely the cotton, tea, goods such as that. A lot of local Indian textile artisans or manufacturers were actually put out of business because of the competition with European textile artisans or manufacturers. A lot of British textile companies would end up selling finished products back to India at high prices. So the cotton would be taken out of India, it would be turned into textiles and then sold back at a higher price than what the local artisan would charge for that same textile. And over time, overall the English were pretty, oppressive at times. The people of India lacked a lot of civil rights. They were not allowed to travel freely. They were forced to make or purchase obviously not only textiles but even salt from the mother country. So this is Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, who resisted imperial rule in the early 20th century. He kind of followed. He kind of was a kind of an inspiration to Dr. King, but he kind of employed nonviolent protests such as boycotting salt, for example. He encouraged Indians to make their own salt. He had a salt march where they actually marched to the sea as a symbolic protest. And even he and others would produce their own textiles. They would weave their own clothing, again, to kind of hurt the economy of England. And it did, it worked. Eventually, India was given their independence. There was another famous event that kind of represented this conflict between local Indians and the British government. So sepoys were Indian soldiers who were under British control. But there was a conflict later on where Indian soldiers were not happy that the British were requiring them to grease their rifles with cow and pig fat. That went against their Hindu beliefs. It was believed that the British were trying to convert them and manipulate them, and the response was a revolt. And the British response was even more violent. So the Sepoy Rebellion or mutiny didn't turn out very well for the Indian soldiers, and that only led to increased British control. The colonial government going forward would just take pretty much direct orders from London. And again, that's where you're going to start to see more of an oppressive rule that would result in Gandhi's independence movement. All right, China. China opens its doors in the 1700s to Britain. Early on, Britain was only allowed to trade in one city, the city of Canton. What was one of the goods that was profitable would be opium. British merchants actually sold Indian opium to the Chinese for tea. And this had a horrible impact on the Chinese. Drug addiction, silver flowed out of China to purchase some of these goods from India and even England. Eventually, the Chinese would recognize this was a problem. They would outlaw the opium and execute drug dealers. And eventually, they called on England to end the trade. This led to the Opium Wars, where British gunboats and Chinese forces clashed. But it resulted pretty much in victory for the English. And that resulted in the Treaty of Nanjing, where not only did the British get paid for their war losses, they gained Hong Kong and 5 ports. So pretty much as a result of this Opium War, England had even more openings to China by 1839. So that's going to grow. China was never really a direct colony, more like indirect. Hong Kong was the only part of China that was being governed by England, but the increase in trade had a huge impact on at least Chinese culture and obviously the Chinese economy. India was directly ruled. That's the difference. All right, so what are some other aspects of English and European colonization in China? The Sino-Japanese War, a war between the Japanese and actually the Chinese, was a defeat for the Chinese in 1894, opening it up further to imperialism. And that leads to something called spheres of influence. So as a result of that war, as China became more weakened by the early 1900s, that's when basically China gets divided up like a pizza, as you can see in the cartoon. The British would take the Chang River Valley and govern that part of China. The French would basically govern or oversee Indochina, which would be Vietnam today. Germany and Russia would take land in northern China. And even though the U.S. didn't have any kind of direct control of a part of China, they did establish an open door policy where they called on all these European countries to keep the door open to trade from all over the world, mostly their trade. So the U.S. was concerned that perhaps eventually one of these countries would take full control of China. That was not the case, but again, that was the fear of the United States, and that would impact trade. There was a resistance to this in 1899. A group of Chinese rebels known as the Righteous Harmonious Fists, also known as the Boxers, started to attack Westerners. The response was a military response by these European, kind of a multinational force that included soldiers from the United States and England, put down the Boxer Rebellion, and again, just led to more westernization of China. All right, Africa. Again, what was in Africa that was, necessary? Oils, gold, ivory, diamonds, lots of gems and minerals that were attractive to Europeans. The first kind of Europe, not the first, but one of the more historical contacts that is in history would be this Dr. Livingstone. So he was a missionary who was against the slave trade, but he did believe that Africa could benefit from Europe, especially from a religious and economic standpoint. So he actually traveled into Africa to kind of begin that missionary work. He kind of disappeared for a few years, and he was actually tracked down by Henry Stanley, another kind of traveler or explorer. He found Livingstone in Tanzania, Africa, and the famous line is, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. But what's important about it is now you have, again, the Portuguese explored the outer rim of Africa, and now you have these two men who are going in the inner rim of Africa, in the inner parts of Africa, and establishing contact there, kind of exploring for the first time, perhaps taking notes, writing down their analysis, maps. So this really is not good for the people of Africa, but it is the beginning of, again, the land grab that's going to happen. The Congo. So in 1875, Belgium starts to establish a colony in the Congo. The king was Leopold. He actually hired Stanley to explore the Congo, and then they established basically a slave-like system. Family members were held hostage, and over many years, about 8 million workers were perished through this system. So again, a great example of the destruction of European contact, right? The King Leopold's labor system, for example. Eventually, this is basically what it would look like, this land grab. France would conquer northern Africa, Algeria especially, also colonies in the western part of Africa. England would also take chunks of western and eastern Africa. Where's England? England is yellow right here. One problem when they started to divide up Africa, they didn't have any regard for ethnic boundaries, and that was a problem. So what you were doing, you were kind of you were combining different groups of people into one region, and maybe there wasn't a problem when England was in charge, but when England left, now these different ethnic groups were kind of free to really do whatever they wanted, and that would lead to a lot of civil war. One famous example of that would be in Rwanda. Rwanda would be right over here, the Belgian Congo. And there were two groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. We'll see a movie about this, actually. It's an interesting story. The Tutsis were minority. They were a minority group, but they were embraced by the Belgians because of their skin color. They were lighter skin. They were treated better. They were given better positions in business and in government. Where the majority were the Hutus, who were darker skin. And they basically rebelled in 1993 with a kind of a war against the Tutsis. Horrible genocide. A million people were killed. Again, the movie's called Hotel Rwanda. We'll definitely see that at the end of the year. But really a tragic event. But again, it happens because of what was established by Europeans, where they would, again, kind of, they didn't really respect or understand these ethnic divisions and groupings. And that's a famous image of the genocide. Really, the movie's phenomenal, but definitely a powerful film. All right, another important aspect to colonization would be the Suez Canal. This was built in the 1800s. The English took control of this. Why? Because they wanted to control travel between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Again, it's just another example of this these imperialistic actions to basically dominate the economy of this entire region. Egyptian workers were put to work. not paid for it, so it was almost like slave labor. It's still today a very important transportation route. Today it is governed by the Egyptians. All right, 1884, the Berlin Conference. European nations met in Africa. No African empires were involved, and basically they set ground rules for colonization. So basically, they're green lighting, the seizure of Africa, the carving up of Africa. So that could be on a test. Again, a significant historical event. So in 1884, the European nations met in Berlin, Germany, to kind of set rules for colonization. This was a seminal or significant moment where this was basically the final nail in the coffin for Africa, where it was basically, this land grab was now almost legalized or justified. And unfortunately, the African nations had no representation, no voice at this conference. So this is more of a turning point moment. All right, so South Africa was also an important colony. In the early stages, it was British. Eventually, in the 1800s, early on it was Dutch. It was a Dutch colony, but it was replaced, or the British took it over in 1800. They controlled it till about 1858. The English fought the native many conflicts during this time between the English and the South African people, or the Xhosa. There was a famous war known as the Xhosa cattle killing movement, where British livestock were spreading disease, and the locals ended up killing the cattle, destroying the crops, with the purpose of hopefully destroying the British, or at least pushing the British out. Unfortunately, that only led to famine, so it kind of backfired. But again, it shows you that the natives were not really happy about this, and they were willing to fight for their freedoms. There was the Anglo-Zulu War in the 1870s, where the Zulu kingdom also went to war against the British. But like most conflicts, the British usually were victorious. And as a result, they gained pretty much the entire South African coast of the Indian Ocean. So again, war was common, especially in South Africa, again, between locals and the British. The Boer War is a very famous war. Again, between the English and the Afrikaners. So 1880 and 1899. So the Afrikaners were actually, so yes, you had maybe, African peoples, but you also had Europeans who had been there for decades. Those Afrikaners, kind of like Creoles, right? Spanish born in the Americas, for example. So they weren't too thrilled either with English rule. So the Afrikaners and Africans over time were being driven from their lands by the British, mostly because of the discovery of diamonds and other gems and precious metals. It should be MET, sorry. The British put many of these people into concentration camps. 15,000 died. The black camps were much worse off than the white camps. But either way, any resistance was met again with force by the British. And eventually the Afrikaners and the Africans were put onto poor locations. So just another example of really the oppressive British policies to kind of control really every colony, including South Africa. All right, let's talk about Latin America. So, the Spanish dominated Latin America, as did the British. But by 1823, the United States had emerged as a pretty powerful nation, and they really wanted, they didn't want colonies, they didn't want to control anyone, but they really wanted to be able to trade freely in the Caribbean region. I think they feared that. So we established something called the Monroe Doctrine, where President James Monroe basically stated to Europeans to stay out of the Caribbean, the Americas. It was probably masked our desire to have colonies, but we didn't really argue it that way. It was more for, let the people of the Caribbean be independent. But what we really wanted is to have our own influence there. And that's pretty evident in 1898. We studied this in US 1, if you recall, the Spanish-American War, where we went to war with the Spanish over control of Cuba. And as a result of that war, we did gain colonies, at least temporarily. We governed the Philippines for many years, and Puerto Rico and Cuba. Eventually, Puerto Rico became more of a territory, as did Guam. Today, Puerto Rico is its own independent nation, but it is kind of considered a protectorate where we kind of, we help them, right? Um, the Filipino War gave us the Philippines for a while. We did put down our own rebellion, right? There was the Filipino rebellion where the local Filipinos went to war with us. Eventually, though, we too gave them independence. But again, for about, I'd say, 40 or 50 years, we had colonies. And eventually, same with Cuba, where Cuba was given its independence. In 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt also kind of had his own Monroe Doctrine, where he kind of restated the goals of the Monroe Doctrine. And he basically, took the role, or he believed the United States had a role as a police power to, again, protect and not govern, but ensure the prosperity and freedom of, these Latin nations. Probably economics played a big role. I think he believed that the Caribbean could be a great market for American goods. So I think he wanted, again, those nations to be free. He also saw a place like Cuba as a great place for a military base, for example. So I think he saw a lot of value in making sure that these countries, these islands were independent. He actually did send troops to the Dominican Republic to ensure that they paid off debts to Europe. His big fear was if they didn't pay off their debts to, say, Germany, the Germans or the English would come in and take over the Dominican. So we intervened. We didn't necessarily govern. We did govern the Dominican until they were kind of on their own. But again, another example of maybe not imperialism, but interventionism. All right, so how do local people resist? Not only, we mentioned war, obviously. Um, you know, it's interesting that local, when local Indian people would be educated. Gandhi spent his education in England, for example. That didn't necessarily give them any equality or opportunity, unfortunately. But as time would go on, these educated elites would kind of form resistance groups or organizations to promote independence, and Gandhi did that. So, for example, in 1885, not Gandhi, but these earlier Indian elites did form the Indian National Congress, kind of a forum for them to air their grievances, kind of an early example of self-rule. I'm sure that these elites inspired Gandhi to kind of continue that, and he did. There was also the Pan-African movement, a cultural movement, but not in Africa, mostly in the United States and Europe. Two famous Americans who promoted Pan-Africanism would be W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. And basically it was this idea of pushing for and celebrating African independence. And they did it by embracing their own roots. Marcus Garvey even established a Back to Africa movement where he sought to bring African Americans back to Africa. So it really wasn't a long-lasting movement, but it's just another example of at least people with African roots trying to help grow an independence movement in Africa. All right, so that's it. All right, guys, that's it. Good luck on your test. Definitely go through the lecture a little bit. Make sure you understand these concepts. Every question on the exam was mentioned on this lecture, so maybe review it one more time. All right, good luck.